I was standing outside my own house with two suitcases, watching the door slam shut in my face, while my own son stood behind it and said nothing. In that moment, I lost more than a home. I lost the family I thought I had. What they didn't know was that just hours earlier, everything had already changed in a way they could never imagine. And the truth is, sometimes the deepest betrayals don't break you, they wake you up. Before we dive into today's story, take a moment to share where you're watching from. We love seeing how our stories bring people together from every corner of the world. Your thoughts and comments are what make this community so special, and we're truly grateful to have you here. If you haven't already, don't forget to hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications so you never miss a new story filled with drama, resilience, and unexpected twists. Now, settle in, get comfortable, and maybe grab your favorite drink, because this is a tale you won't want to miss. Let's get started. My name is Margaret Collins, and I am 65 years old. For most of my life, I believed I understood what stability meant. I believed that if you worked hard, loved deeply, and stayed loyal to your family, life would eventually settle into something safe and predictable. That belief carried me through 40 years of marriage, through raising a son, and through every quiet, ordinary day that made up what I once called a good life. My husband, Richard, was a construction contractor. He built homes for a living, but more importantly, he built our life piece by piece with his own hands. We were not wealthy, but we were steady. We owned a modest house in Tacoma, Washington, the kind of place where every scratch on the wall had a story behind it. I could walk through that house with my eyes closed and still know exactly where I was. It was not just a home. It was proof that our life together had mattered. When Richard died, everything changed in a way I was not prepared for. It was sudden, the kind of loss that does not give you time to adjust. One day we were arguing about something small, and the next day I was sitting alone in a quiet house that no longer felt alive. The silence became unbearable. Every room echoed with memories, and instead of comfort, those memories began to feel heavy. My son, Daniel, tried to help. He called often, visited when he could, and gently suggested that I should not be living alone anymore. Daniel had always been a good son. He was thoughtful, responsible, and the kind of man I believed Richard would have been proud of. When he and his wife, Olivia, mentioned they were planning to buy a townhouse in Seattle, he suggested that I move in with them. At the time, the idea felt right. It felt practical and comforting. I told myself that this was what families did. They stayed close. They supported one another. I did not want to spend the rest of my life sitting alone in a house that reminded me of everything I had lost. Selling my home in Tacoma was the hardest decision I had made in years. I remember standing in the living room one last time, running my hand along the wall, trying to memorize the feeling of it. But I convinced myself that I was not losing something. I was moving forward. When Daniel found a townhouse in Seattle, I offered to help with the down payment. The property was expensive, more than they could comfortably afford on their own. I contributed nearly 70% of the initial cost. It felt like the right thing to do. I was investing in our shared future. There was a moment, brief but real, when someone asked if my name should also be on the deed. I remember hesitating, just for a second. Then I dismissed it. Daniel was my son. I trusted him completely. Family did not need contracts. The townhouse was modern and clean, very different from the home I had left behind. At first, everything seemed hopeful. We shared meals, talked in the evenings, and tried to build new routines together. Olivia was polite, composed, and organized. She ran the household with precision. Looking back now, I realized there were small signs I chose to ignore. But at the time, I believed I had made the right decision. I believed I had found a new beginning. I had no idea that the foundation I thought was secure was already beginning to crack. If you're still watching and already feel something shifting beneath the surface, comment number 1 below to let me know you're with me. Now, let's move on to Chapter 2. The first few months in the townhouse felt almost like a quiet landing after a long fall. I settled into a routine that gave my days structure again. Mornings were slow and peaceful. I would wake early, make coffee, and stand by the kitchen window watching the soft gray Seattle sky. In the evenings, the three of us often shared dinner. Daniel would talk about work, Olivia would listen and occasionally add something thoughtful, and I would sit there feeling grateful that I was not alone. At first, Olivia was polite in a way that felt effortless. She kept the house immaculate, everything in its place, everything running smoothly. I admired that about her. After years of managing my own household, it felt almost comforting to let someone else take control of the details. I told myself that this was what a shared home looked like: different people, different habits, learning to adjust. The first change was small enough that I almost dismissed it entirely. One afternoon, I had left a stack of books and a folded blanket on the living room chair where I liked to sit. Olivia noticed them as she walked by and paused for just a second before speaking. She suggested gently that I keep personal items in my room so the shared space could remain tidy. Her tone was calm, even polite, but something about it lingered with me. Still, I smiled and agreed. It seemed reasonable. A few days later, another moment followed. Olivia mentioned that when guests came over, it might be better if I spent time upstairs. She explained that it would help the space feel more comfortable for everyone. The words themselves were carefully chosen, almost professional. Comfort, privacy, flow. Each one sounded harmless on its own, but together they created a quiet distance I could not ignore. Daniel was there when she said it. He nodded slightly, as if it made sense, and then returned to whatever he had been looking at on his phone. He did not look at me. He did not question it. That silence stayed with me longer than Olivia's words. I began to adjust without thinking too much about it. I kept my belongings neatly in my room. I spent more evenings upstairs, watching television alone instead of sitting in the living room. Sometimes I even ate earlier than the others, just to avoid being in the way if Olivia had plans. It happened gradually, so gradually that I almost convinced myself it was normal. But the house began to feel different. The spaces that once felt open now seemed to carry invisible boundaries. The living room no longer felt like a place I could simply walk into. The kitchen felt like a space I had to pass through quickly, not linger in. I found myself moving more quietly, speaking less, making sure I did not disrupt anything. One evening, while we were clearing dishes, Olivia mentioned that people our age often preferred having their own independence. She said it casually, as if it were just an observation. I nodded, but something about the way she said it made me uneasy. It felt less like a comment and more like a suggestion wrapped in politeness. Daniel said nothing. That was the part I could not quite understand, not the words themselves, but the absence of anything from him. I had raised him to be thoughtful, to speak up when something felt wrong. Yet now, he seemed to exist just outside the tension, as if avoiding it would somehow make it disappear. I told myself I was overthinking. Families go through adjustments. Living together is never simple. But late at night, lying in the quiet of my room, I began to feel something I had not expected to feel in my own home. I felt like I was slowly being moved aside, one small step at a time. If you're starting to notice the subtle changes in tension building, comment number 2 below so I know you're paying attention. Now let's move on to Chapter 3. By the time the conversation happened, the house already felt different. It was not something I could point to directly, but I could feel it in the way the air seemed tighter, in the way silence lingered longer than it used to. Even the kitchen, which had once felt like a shared space, now felt like a place where I needed to be careful with my presence. That evening, Olivia had spread a few papers across the kitchen table. Bills, I assumed. Daniel stood near the counter, scrolling through his phone, his posture slightly tense. I could tell something was coming before anyone said a word. There was a stillness in the room that made my chest tighten. Olivia began calmly, almost as if she were presenting a report. She mentioned that expenses had been increasing. Utilities were higher than expected. Groceries were costing more. The mortgage, she added, was a consistent pressure. Her voice was steady, measured, and completely controlled. There was no emotion in it, only calculation. I nodded, trying to follow her reasoning. I told her that I had been contributing where I could, buying groceries most weeks and covering smaller household costs. I said it gently, not wanting to sound defensive. For a moment, I thought that might be enough. But Olivia leaned back slightly, her expression unchanged. She spoke about fairness, about how, in a shared living situation, everyone should contribute in proportion to what they use. The phrasing felt deliberate, almost rehearsed. I felt a small knot form in my stomach. Then she said it clearly. She suggested that I begin contributing a monthly amount, something closer to what she described as a rental share. The word itself seemed to echo in my mind. Rent, in a house I had helped pay for. I looked at her, certain I must have misunderstood. I reminded her, carefully, that I had contributed a significant portion of the down payment, that the house would not have been possible without that support. My voice felt quieter than I expected, as if I were trying to keep the moment from breaking apart. Olivia did not raise her voice. She did not argue. Instead, she clarified. There was no written agreement stating that my contribution had secured ownership or long-term rights. Without that, she explained, it could reasonably be interpreted as a gift. The way she said it carried the weight of certainty. She was not speaking as a daughter-in-law. She was speaking as a lawyer. I turned to Daniel. I did not say his name out loud, but I looked at him in a way that I hoped would reach him. I needed him to say something, anything that acknowledged what I had done for them. But he avoided my eyes. After a moment, he muttered that they were just trying to figure things out, that it was not meant to be personal. Not meant to be personal. The words landed harder than anything Olivia had said. I sat there, trying to understand how the conversation had shifted so far from what I believed to be true. I had not given that money as a gift. I had given it as part of a shared future, as a way to build something together, but suddenly, that understanding no longer mattered. What mattered was what could be proven. The room fell into a heavy silence after that. Olivia gathered the papers as if the discussion had reached its natural conclusion. Daniel remained quiet, his presence somehow both there and absent at the same time. I stayed at the table for a few moments longer, staring at the surface in front of me. Something inside me had shifted, something I could not undo. This was no longer a simple misunderstanding or a temporary tension. This was the moment I realized I was standing on ground that was no longer mine. If that moment made you question everything about trust and family, comment number 3 below to stay with me. Now, let's move on to chapter 4. After that conversation, nothing in the house was openly different, yet everything felt altered in a way I could not ignore. There had been no final decision, no raised voices, no clear resolution, and yet something had shifted beneath the surface. Something that made every interaction feel careful, measured, and slightly distant. In the days that followed, Olivia became noticeably colder. She remained polite, but the warmth that had once existed, even if only on the surface, was gone. Her tone was efficient, her movements precise, as if everything in the house had been reduced to function rather than feeling. Conversations became brief and practical. There was no space left for anything personal. Daniel, on the other hand, seemed to retreat entirely. He left early in the morning and returned late in the evening. When we were in the same room, he appeared distracted, always focused on something else. It became clear that he was avoiding being alone with me. That realization hurt more than I expected. One morning, I finally decided to speak with him. The house was quiet, and Olivia had already left for work. It felt like the only moment I might have his full attention. I approached him gently, asking if he truly agreed with what had been said about money and contribution. I tried to keep my voice calm, steady, even understanding. Daniel did not meet my eyes. He spoke about stress, about rising costs, about how complicated things had become. Then he said something that stayed with me long after the conversation ended. He said that Olivia understood these matters better, that she had experience with property and finances, and that he trusted her judgment. I stood there, realizing that whatever role I believed I had in that house had already been replaced, not formally, not openly, but quietly and completely. The authority I thought came from years of motherhood and sacrifice had no weight in the face of legal knowledge and structured thinking. I returned to my room that morning with a heaviness I could not shake. For the first time, I allowed myself to consider a possibility I had been avoiding. Maybe this was not temporary. Maybe this was not something that would resolve itself with time or patience. Later that week, I noticed something else. The furniture in the living room had been rearranged. The chair I used to sit in was no longer there. In its place was a decorative table with a small plant, carefully positioned to match the rest of the room. It was a small change, almost insignificant, but it felt deliberate, as if my presence had been quietly erased from the space. That same afternoon, I came across a printed document left on the counter. It was a draft listing description for the house. My heart tightened as I read the words. It described the property as move-in ready, perfect for a new family. There was no mention of shared ownership, no acknowledgement of anything beyond what was legally recorded. When I asked Olivia about it, she responded casually. She said it was only a possibility, something they were considering for the future. Her tone suggested that it was not something I needed to worry about, but I knew better. That evening, while passing by the office room, I noticed another set of documents partially visible on the desk. Curiosity led me closer. What I saw made my hands tremble. It was paperwork for a second mortgage, taken against the house. I stared at the numbers, at the signatures, at the dates. Olivia had borrowed money using the house as collateral, and no one had told me. In that moment, something inside me shifted completely. This was no longer about discomfort or adjustment. This was something else entirely. This was control. And I had just realized how little of it I actually had. If you can feel that something bigger is about to happen, comment number 4 below, so I know you're still here. Now, let's move on to chapter 5. After I found the mortgage documents, something inside me refused to settle back into silence. I did not confront Olivia immediately. I carried the knowledge quietly, letting it sit with me, letting it change the way I saw everything around me. The house no longer felt uncertain. It felt calculated. Every small decision, every shift in tone, every quiet exclusion now seemed intentional. That evening, we sat down for dinner like we always did. The table was set neatly, the plates arranged with precision, but the air felt heavy, almost suffocating. No one spoke at first. I could hear the faint hum of the refrigerator, the distant sound of traffic outside. I tried to focus on something ordinary, something steady, but my thoughts kept circling back to what I had seen. Olivia was the one who finally broke the silence. Her voice was calm, but there was a firmness in it that left no room for misunderstanding. She said that the current living arrangement was no longer working. The words were simple, but they carried a weight that settled deeply in my chest. I looked at Daniel, hoping for some sign that this was not what it sounded like, but he remained still, his expression unreadable. He did not interrupt her. Olivia continued, explaining that it would be best if I started making plans to move out. She spoke as if she were outlining a practical solution, something logical and necessary. There was no hesitation in her voice, no trace of doubt. For a moment, I could not speak. The room seemed to narrow around me. When I finally found my voice, I reminded them of the money I had contributed, of the fact that I had helped make this home possible. The words came out softer than I intended, as if I were trying to convince myself as much as them. Olivia responded without emotion. She repeated what she had said before, that there was no legal agreement tying my contribution to ownership. The house, she said, belonged to Daniel. I turned to him again, searching for something familiar, something that resembled the son I had raised. He shifted slightly and said that maybe it would be better this way. His voice was quiet, almost apologetic, but it did nothing to change the meaning behind his words. In that moment, I understood something I had been resisting. This was not a disagreement. It was a decision they had already made. The rest of the evening passed in a blur. I went to my room, but sleep never came. I lay awake, staring at the ceiling, replaying every moment that had led to this, every choice, every assumption, every time I had trusted without question. When morning came, the house felt unnaturally quiet. I got dressed slowly, my movements careful, as if I were trying not to disturb something fragile. As I stepped into the hallway, I heard voices downstairs. Olivia and Daniel were speaking, their tones low but purposeful. I caught only fragments, enough to understand that whatever had been decided the night before was already in motion. I walked toward the front of the house, my heart beginning to pound. The door was open. For a second, I did not understand what I was seeing. 2 suitcases sat neatly on the porch. My suitcases. I stepped closer, my mind struggling to catch up with what my eyes were telling me. Everything I owned, everything I had brought into this house, had been packed, without my knowledge, without my permission. I turned back toward them, my voice unsteady as I asked what this meant. Olivia met my gaze calmly and confirmed that it was time for me to leave. There was no anger in her expression, only certainty. Daniel stood beside her, his eyes fixed somewhere just beyond me. I waited for him to say something, to stop this, to recognize what was happening, but he did not move. Slowly, I walked outside, the weight of the moment pressing down on me with every step. Olivia followed just long enough to move one of the suitcases further onto the porch, as if ensuring there was no confusion. Then she stepped back inside. The door closed behind her. A second later, I heard the lock click, and just like that, I was no longer part of that house. I sat on the damp edge of the sidewalk longer than I cared to admit, staring at the closed front door as if it might open again if I waited long enough. The Seattle air carried a light chill, the kind that settles into your bones without asking permission. My suitcases stood beside me, quiet and final, as if they were the only proof that I had ever belonged inside that house. For a while, I could not think clearly. Everything felt distant, almost unreal. The sound of passing cars, the faint rustle of leaves, even my own breathing seemed detached from me. I replayed the morning over and over, trying to understand how something so permanent could happen so quickly. There had been no warning that felt this final, no moment where I believed I was truly about to lose everything. But it was not just the house. It was the realization that I had been pushed out of a life I believed was still mine. The trust I had carried for years, the quiet certainty that family would always hold together, had disappeared in a single decisive moment. Eventually, I stood up. Sitting there any longer felt like surrender. I picked up my suitcases and began walking without a clear destination. Each step felt heavy, not just from the weight I carried in my hands, but from the uncertainty ahead of me. I had nowhere planned, no immediate solution, only the need to move. A small cafe came into view, a few blocks away. I stepped inside, grateful for the warmth and the low hum of voices that made the space feel alive. I found a seat near the window and set my suitcases beside me. My hands were still trembling slightly as I reached into my purse. That was when I saw it. The lottery ticket. For a moment, I simply stared at it, unsure why it even mattered. I had bought it without thinking, a small habit left over from years of watching my husband do the same. It had never meant anything before. It had never been more than a passing thought. I almost put it back, but something made me pause. I took out my phone and pulled up the numbers. My fingers felt cold as I held the ticket closer, reading each number carefully. The first one matched. I frowned slightly, assuming it was coincidence. Then the second number matched. A small tension began to form in my chest. By the time I reached the third and fourth numbers, my breathing had changed. I leaned closer to the screen, checking again, slower this time. Each number aligned perfectly. My heart began to pound in a way that made it difficult to focus. When I reached the final number, I hesitated. Then I checked it. It matched. I sat back in the chair, unable to move. The noise of the cafe seemed to fade into the background as the realization settled in. $55 million. The number did not feel real. Nothing about it made sense in that moment. Just hours earlier, I had been standing outside my home with nowhere to go. Now, I held something that could change everything. And then, as if the moment needed one more layer of disbelief, I remembered something else. A conversation from years ago, something my husband had mentioned but I had never followed up on. A small investment account he had set aside, separate from everything else. I had dismissed it at the time, thinking it insignificant. Now, it no longer felt that way. The thought settled quietly in my mind. I was not as helpless as I had believed. For the first time since that morning, my breathing steadied. The fear did not disappear, but it shifted. It became something else, something clearer. I folded the ticket carefully and placed it back in my wallet. I did not call anyone. I did not celebrate. I did not react. Instead, I sat there and understood something important. Everything had changed. And this time, I would decide what happened next. If that twist changed everything for you, comment number 6 below and let me know you're still with me. Now, let's move on to chapter 7. When I stepped out of the cafe, the world looked exactly the same. Cars moved through the streets, people passed by without a second glance, and the gray Seattle sky hung low as it always did. Nothing around me had changed, and yet, everything inside me had shifted in a way I could not ignore. I stood there for a moment, holding on to my suitcases, aware that I was no longer the same person who had walked into that cafe. Just hours earlier, I had been someone with no clear direction, someone pushed out of her own life. Now, I carried a truth that could alter everything, though no one else knew it. There was only one person I trusted enough to call, Helen. My hands were steadier now as I dialed her number. When she answered, I did not explain everything. I simply told her that I needed a place to stay for a while. She did not ask questions. She told me to come over. Helen's house was warm, in a way that felt almost unfamiliar after everything that had happened. The moment I stepped inside, I felt a quiet sense of relief. It was not dramatic. It was not overwhelming. It was simply the absence of tension, and that alone was enough to make my shoulders loosen for the first time that day. I placed my suitcases near the guest room and sat down on the edge of the bed. The exhaustion I had been holding back finally settled into me, not as tears or anger, but as a deep, quiet heaviness. I had lost something that could not be easily replaced. Not just a home, but a sense of belonging I had believed was secure. Later that afternoon, I began to think about what needed to be done next. The lottery ticket remained in my wallet, carefully folded, almost unreal. I searched online for information about claiming the prize. The process was more complex than I had expected. There were legal steps, verification procedures, and most importantly, recommendations to remain anonymous for as long as possible. That part made sense to me. Trust, I realized, was no longer something I could offer freely. Not after what had happened. Information, like money, needed to be protected. In the evening, Helen mentioned something that confirmed what I had already begun to suspect. She had heard from someone in the neighborhood that I had moved out voluntarily. The story was simple, clean, and completely untrue. According to Olivia, I had decided I wanted more independence. I listened quietly as Helen spoke, and for a moment, I felt a faint sense of disbelief, not because I doubted it, but because of how easily the truth had been replaced. It took so little effort to reshape the story, to make it sound reasonable, even acceptable. I did not correct it. Not yet. That night, my phone buzzed. It was Daniel. His message was brief, asking if I was all right. There was hesitation in his words, a distance that had not been there before. I responded simply, telling him I was fine. Nothing more. I did not mention where I was. I did not mention the ticket. For the first time, I understood that what I chose to say, and what I chose to keep silent, mattered more than anything else. As I lay in bed that night, staring at the unfamiliar ceiling, I realized something important. I was no longer trying to fix what had happened. I was preparing for what came next. A few days passed at Helen's house, and for the first time since everything had happened, I began to feel a sense of steadiness return. The shock had settled into something quieter, something more focused. My thoughts were no longer scattered. They moved with purpose now, guided by a clarity I had not felt in a long time. I found myself thinking in two different directions at once. There was the version of events that the outside world believed, the one where I had chosen to leave, where everything had unfolded neatly and without conflict. And then there was the truth, the version I carried with me, the one shaped by what I had seen, what I had lost, and what I now understood. That contrast became impossible to ignore. It was no longer enough to sit and process what had happened. I needed to act. The first step was finding the right attorney. I did not rush the decision. Trust was no longer something I gave easily. I researched carefully, reading through profiles, looking for someone who understood both financial structure and property law. Eventually, I scheduled a meeting with a firm that specialized in exactly that. The office was quiet and professional, the kind of place where everything felt deliberate. When I sat down across from the attorney, I did not feel intimidated. I felt prepared. I explained everything: the sale of my home in Tacoma, the contribution I had made toward the townhouse, the absence of any written agreement, and the way I had been asked to leave. He listened without interrupting, taking notes occasionally, his attention steady and precise. Then he asked about the financial records. I told him I had access to the bank transfers, that every payment could be traced directly back to my account. That detail seemed to matter. He leaned back slightly and explained that without documentation labeling the money as a gift, the situation could be interpreted differently. In simple terms, my contribution could still carry weight. For the first time since that conversation at the kitchen table, I felt something shift in my favor. I had not been wrong. The truth had not disappeared simply because someone chose to ignore it. It had only been waiting to be recognized in the right context. Then the discussion moved further. He asked about any additional financial activity connected to the house. I hesitated for a moment before mentioning the documents I had seen. The second mortgage. The loan taken against the property without my knowledge. His expression changed slightly, not dramatically, but enough for me to notice. He explained that such actions, depending on how they were structured, could introduce complications, not just for ownership, but for liability as well. In that moment, I understood something important. This was no longer just about what I had contributed. It was about leverage. I had options now. I could push aggressively, force the situation into conflict, expose every detail. Or I could move carefully, choosing each step with intention. I chose restraint. I did not want destruction. I wanted clarity. I wanted fairness. The attorney suggested filing a notice to formally establish my financial interest, a way to ensure that any potential sale of the house would not proceed without acknowledging my position. I agreed. As I left the office, I felt a quiet sense of control settle over me. For the first time since that morning on the sidewalk, I was no longer reacting. I was deciding, and when that notice reached them, I knew one thing for certain. This time, they would be the ones caught off guard. If you can see how the balance of power has completely shifted, comment number 8 below to stay with me until the end. Now, let's move on to the final outcome of this story. A few days after the legal notice was filed, I knew the call would come. I did not feel anxious waiting for it. If anything, I felt a quiet sense of certainty. For the first time since everything had happened, I was not the one reacting. I was prepared. When my phone rang and I saw Daniel's name, I let it ring once before answering. His voice sounded uncertain, almost unfamiliar. He told me they had received a letter from a law firm. He said it mentioned a financial claim connected to the house. There was confusion in his words, as if he were still trying to make sense of it. I confirmed it simply, without explanation. There was a pause on the line, the kind that stretches longer than expected. Then he asked why I had not said anything before. I considered the question briefly, but I did not answer it directly. Some things no longer required explanation. A moment later, Olivia's voice joined the call. Her tone had changed. It was still controlled, still measured, but there was something else beneath it now. Caution. She described the situation as a misunderstanding, suggesting that perhaps things had not been clearly communicated. I listened without interrupting. It was striking how quickly the language had shifted. The certainty she once carried was now replaced with careful phrasing. She mentioned the house, the listing, the interest from potential buyers. She pointed out that the legal notice could complicate the sale. I acknowledged that calmly. I told her I was aware of the situation. Then I stated, as simply as I could, that my financial contribution needed to be recognized. I did not raise my voice. I did not argue. I spoke in terms of facts, not feelings. There was another pause, shorter this time. Olivia did not disagree. Instead, she suggested meeting in person to discuss a resolution. We agreed to meet at my attorney's office. The room was neutral, quiet, designed for clarity rather than emotion. Daniel looked different when he walked in. Tired, uncertain, as if the weight of everything had finally reached him. Olivia remained composed, but the sharp confidence she once carried had softened. My attorney presented the financial records clearly. Every transfer, every detail, laid out in a way that could not be dismissed. He explained how my contribution affected the ownership structure, how it could impact the sale if left unresolved. Olivia listened carefully. This time, she did not challenge the facts. Daniel spoke once, quietly. He apologized. The words were sincere, but they arrived too late to carry the meaning they once might have held. I acknowledged them with a nod, nothing more. The conversation shifted toward resolution. If the house sold, I would receive a proportional share of the profit. The terms were discussed, clarified, and eventually accepted. It was not reconciliation. It was agreement. When the meeting ended, I stood up without hesitation. There was no sense of victory, only clarity. As I walked out of the building, I realized something had changed permanently. I no longer needed their understanding, and they still had no idea how much had already changed. Weeks passed, and the situation with the house resolved itself in a way that felt almost distant from everything that had led up to it. The property sold, the agreements were honored, and my share was transferred without complication. It was a clean ending to something that had once felt painfully tangled. I moved soon after, not back to Seattle, but further south, to a quiet coastal town in Oregon. The house I chose was smaller than the one I had left behind, but it felt entirely mine in a way I had not experienced in years. The windows faced the ocean, and in the mornings, the light came in soft and steady, without interruption. My days became simple. I woke when I wanted, made coffee in my own kitchen, and sat by the window watching the horizon stretch endlessly in front of me. There were no unspoken rules, no careful movements, no sense that I needed to adjust myself to fit into someone else's space. For the first time in a long while, I felt at ease in my own life. I did not spend much time thinking about what had happened, not because I had forgotten, but because I no longer needed to revisit it. The answers had already revealed themselves. I understood now that trust without boundaries is not kindness, and that love without respect does not hold. Daniel reached out again after the house was sold. His messages were careful, almost hesitant. He said he had been thinking about everything, that he regretted how things had unfolded. I listened when he called, but I did not step back into what we had lost. There was a difference between hearing someone and returning to them. Sometime later, I learned that he and Olivia had discovered the truth about the lottery. I never asked how. News travels in ways people do not always expect. Not long after, another message came. This one felt different. There was urgency in it, a tone that had not been there before. I read it once, then set my phone aside. I did not respond right away. Not out of anger, but out of clarity. I understood what had changed, and more importantly, what had not. When I finally replied, my words were simple. I wished them well, nothing more. That evening, I stood by the window, watching the tide roll in slowly, steadily, without hesitation. The ocean did not rush, did not force itself forward. It simply moved with quiet certainty, and for the first time in a long time, so did I. In the end, life has a quiet way of revealing truths we once refused to see. What feels like loss can become clarity, and what seems like an ending may simply be a redirection toward something more honest. Not every door that closes is meant to be reopened, and not every relationship is meant to remain unchanged. Sometimes, the greatest strength comes not from holding on, but from knowing when to step forward alone with dignity and self-respect. When trust is broken, it teaches us to value ourselves more carefully, to set boundaries where we once gave freely, and to recognize that peace is not found in approval, but in independence. Thank you for being here and listening to this journey. If this story resonated with you, feel free to share your thoughts in the comments, and do not forget to follow and subscribe for more meaningful stories like this.